Water is just going to follow solutes. You just need to make sure that when you're drinking water, it's going to end up in the appropriate places. And that's going to be from finding the appropriate balance of carbohydrate intake and sodium and potassium. Everything is in preparation for that Friday load. With the rapid backload, I'll load carbohydrates very, very high.
A lot of the assumptions around the quote-unquote sodium-potassium pump and some of the older school approaches kind of mistake the intracellular and extracellular space with the subcutaneous and intramuscular space, which are not synonyms.
It really depends on how they are affected by the chemical. So an enhanced person, it kind of creates more variables to the variables that we're discussing. I use fats because I don't go as crazy with the carb loads, and I want them to hold and not burn through it. And as you use dietary fat, you're going to hold it better.
All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Ice Cream for PRs podcast. My name is Jeff Nippard, and I'm your host. And joining me this week, I've got a panel of guests, all elite level coaches for bodybuilders and other physique athletes. And I'll get to introducing them in just a minute. But first, I just want to remind you guys where it is that you can find this podcast. So first of all, you can listen to it on iTunes and Stitcher, and it's available for download there if you subscribe. So you can find it there just by searching Ice Cream for PRs. That's 4 with like the number 4. Or you can also find it just by searching my name, Jeff Nippard. The video and the audio is available for download on my YouTube channel. So you can find that at youtube.com/Jeff Nippard. And you want to be sure to go over and subscribe there as well, just to make sure that you don't miss future episodes. Also, this podcast is currently unfunded. So if you guys would like to support it, the best way that you can do that is by going to iTunes and leaving me a rating or a review. So if you're enjoying the sort of content that I'm putting out here and you'd like to help me keep it going, that is the best way that you can support me. So in terms of introducing our panel of guests this week, first of all, we've got Cliff Wilson. So Cliff was actually on the podcast a nice few episodes ago now, and we've talked about a whole bunch of stuff to do with contest prep generally, but I don't think we really focused in on peaking per se. We did touch on it, but we also covered a whole bunch of topics around preparing for a bodybuilding or physique show. So for those of you guys who maybe haven't seen that one, Cliff is a contest prep coach at Team Wilson Bodybuilding. He's coached hundreds of competitors to class wins, dozens of pro cards, and other professional and national titles all around the world. So Cliff, it's a real pleasure to have you back, and welcome to the show, man.
I appreciate it, man. The first time was a blast, and being on with these guys, this is going to be a fun one. I know it.
Awesome. So second, we've got Eric Helms. Eric was also on the show before, just a few episodes ago, for the reverse diet debate, where he argued against against reverse dieting, and he went up against Lane Norton and Peter Fitchin, and he was on the side with Menno Henselmans. That was a really good episode. I got a lot of really, really good feedback on that. So Eric, it's great to have you back, man. For people who might not be familiar with Eric, Eric is himself a natural pro bodybuilder. He's a competitive powerlifter. He's got a master's degree in sports nutrition and exercise sciences. He's currently working on his PhD, and he has multiple studies published in scientific journals, and he is himself a coach at 3D Muscle Journey. So Eric, welcome back to the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So last but not least, we've got Jason Theobald. Jason is a contest prep coach. He is the founder at Scooby Prep. He's worked with high-level athletes in the NPC. He's himself a competitive bodybuilder, and he's regularly featured on the Geared Up podcast, which is another show that I recommend. I don't listen to it all the time, but it does have a number of episodes that I did enjoy. So Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's good to be here, and I think with the guys you have on the panel, I'll actually learn something myself. So I was glad to take you up on the offer. So
awesome, I appreciate it. So yeah, guys, like I said, basically what we're going to be doing here is a roundtable. We're going to be focusing only on the topic of peaking for a bodybuilding show or a physique show. My goal with this is for it to serve as the most comprehensive resource on this, available for free online. So I want us to cover all of the variables that we can manipulate, and then also cover all of the facets on the spectrum of competing, from natural bodybuilders, bikini competitors, to guys who are enhanced, physique athletes, and everything in between. So a quick reminder, if you guys maybe aren't able to retain all of the sort of information, or maybe if you find that there's a lot of rapid fire stuff coming at you, feel free to take notes, as I've heard from a lot of listeners that it is helpful if they write things down. If you are listening on YouTube, then I will be annotating the entire show with timestamps, so you can skip through to where we talk about carbs, where we talk about water, and all that stuff. So I guess we'll get going, guys. So the first question that I just wanted to ask you to sort of encompass the whole conversation that follows is, relatively how important is peak week? One often hears that relative to the prep itself, it's of a relatively small importance, but then on the other hand, you have some people that make a really big deal out of it. So if you had to quantify it, about how much of a difference would you say we're looking at in terms of physical improvement as a result of peak week? And I'll start with you, Cliff.
Yeah, one thing I kind of find interesting is, people like to try to put a percentage on it, 1%, 2%. And I will say, compared to the entire prep itself, it is a rather small percentage. But I think it changes depending on the person. I hear a lot of people say, well, if you look good, peak week doesn't matter as much because you already look good and you can coast in. But I almost feel the opposite. I feel like the more ready you are, the more able you are to present a change in your physique. If you're not ready, peak week isn't going to mean anything. It really won't. If you still need to lose, 6 pounds, 7 pounds, you probably can't do much with your peak week. But if you are spot on, then I think you have the ability to manipulate and create positive changes in your physique. So I would say the importance of it rises the more ready that you are, the leaner that you are, and with the higher level of competition you're facing. Because at the professional level, there's going to be a lot less difference between first place and eighth place than there would be at, say, an amateur show.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Eric or Jason, do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I do. First off, I agree with Cliff. And I think one thing why I always take a slightly more conservative stance talking about peak week, especially when it's to a wider audience, is I think while the ability to improve is, small, but maybe more if you're very lean and makes more of a difference at a higher level, the ability to really jack yourself up and look terrible is actually quite large. So if someone is to do absolutely everything wrong during a peak week, they can take someone who looks absolutely ready and make them look like they're 6 weeks out. And I have seen that happen time and time again. So it's one of those things where there is probably a greater potential harm you can do rather than benefit if you're completely doing things in a way that is not optimal. And that's, I think, probably the only thing I'd want to add to what Cliff said.
I actually agree with both things that were just said. What Eric just said was something that I kind of was thinking through my head. I will say beginners place a lot on it, and I usually have to kind of buffer them, and they'll be so excited to get a peak week, and I'm like, it's really, you're not going to be overwhelmed, or you're going to be underwhelmed when you get it. A few changes here, but yeah, I think the percentage of how important it is fairly small, and there is a great percentage for screwing yourself up. So I think everything was stated pretty well there.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. So first of all, I'd like to get into water. I guess that's a fairly big one. So Cliff, do you want to talk about how it is you manipulate water, and if it's close enough related, you can also bring up what it is you do with sodium and potassium at the same time if you want.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first off, water is going to depend a little bit on the person that I'm prepping and which division they're competing in. Uh, Largely, I like to keep water pretty steady across the week. People like to do some crazy things with water, but I think water is one of the variables that will probably remain the most constant, for me at least, from the beginning of the week to the end of the week. I usually like to keep it high. I would estimate that my female competitors will take in anywhere from 1.25 gallons to 2 gallons per day, all the way up through the show. Male competitors probably 2 gallons to 3 gallons all the way through, and that's whether I use a front load, a back load, or anything. The only situation that I do cut water is if I have a female bikini competitor that I think is maybe possibly borderline too lean and too hard for bikini. I will reduce her water with a conservative reduction, not anything dangerous, but I will reduce her water to soften her up a little bit. And, it usually gets the job done quite nicely.
Eric?
I think Cliff probably just broke the brain of about 1,000 people by saying that he reduces water intake to harden people up. I love it.
To soften people up, right?
To soften people up, right? Yeah. Sorry, I can't speak English. But I'm very similar. Water is probably the variable that goes the most unchanged. Like if you were to look at the Excel sheet that I give pretty much everybody, regardless of the other manipulations, a lot of it is, drink your normal amount of water. The one thing, though, that I will bring up is that this is something I've learned with experience, is that stress and changes to your environment make you behaviorally do different things with water. Some people will get stressed and forget to drink. Other people, especially when they're starving, if they have water in front of them, they keep drinking it and they'll keep refilling it, and they'll end up drinking a surprisingly large amount of water or a surprisingly small amount of water. So even though they're drinking to quote-unquote thirst, because they are focused in other places, they're stressed, and all of the stuff that happens during contest prep and at peak week gets in their head, that can change. So I do find with my more, probably my beginner competitors and my more kind of stress ball competitors, I will actually give them a water amount that actually says, hey, drink this much, just to make sure that they're tracking it. But also putting it into context that it's not gonna, like, don't stress if you're 100 milliliters off or something, because that's not a big difference. Since you mentioned sodium and potassium, I will point out that if one drinks more water or drinks less water, that will affect the amount of electrolytes that are in the system as you urinate more or less out. So that's another reason I like to keep it static, because I do actually manipulate sodium a little bit, which I don't know if you want me to get into or wait on.
We'll wait on that and come back around in the second bout of it. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Jason, what do you typically do with water?
Well, I made a few notes, to sit down and have this talk, and I put things that I think I believe because I've definitely changed over 10 years of prepping, and I wrote down that basically for naturals, I use the keywords they did. I keep it more steady and high throughout. But when I'm dealing with an enhanced athlete, it really can be all over the board. It's a feel I get during the diet and how certain chemicals like testosterone and things affect the athlete. And you'll know if a guy is a type of guy who stays really dry, and you can basically do an unchanged water type situation. I just had a guy, and I think it was 1.5 gallons all the way through. He won both Classic Physique and the overall and the bodybuilding open. But you have some guys who are water balloons, and you have to really pull back to get that right look. So I don't know if I need to go into more detail than that, but that's where I'm at on the enhanced versus the naturals. Is there any does that make sense, Jeff?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've often heard that like one of the side effects of steroid use is subcutaneous water retention.
Correct.
So I'd be curious to know how it is exactly that you combat that, and then also how it is you would discriminate between someone who's holding water and someone who just still has fat to lose as an enhanced athlete.
Well, it gets complicated. You've got to pull out the chemical. So let's say we're talking about testosterone is the major one. You would want to pull that out 2 weeks out. But even though you do that, some guys are going to, it takes time to get out of the system and they're going to hold. You're also going to up their Arimidex towards the end or any anti-estrogen they're on, which is also going to help clear out the water. So really by the time they're going in, you would want them on just like an oral, keep it simple, an oral steroid. And then, but, again, you've got to really watch how they hold during their prep. And how can you tell if it's, water or fat? The skin, like let's say we're talking lower back, you can kind of see if it's just a skin flap or if it's an actual, fat still on the back. I think it's just years of experience. But, if it's skin on skin, there's no fat under there. If you tell someone to rub it together and there's no granules, then they're probably just having a little water in there. If they still feel hard granules, well, I'm like, you're still holding fat. So that's kind of what I would be communicating with them. But I think I didn't say, lowering the water could be anywhere from, having them at 3 gallons beginning of the week and down to 1 gallon. But it could be also down to 1/2 gallon on Friday. It really depends on how they are affected by the chemical. So an enhanced person, it kind of creates more variables to the variables that we're discussing.
Right. Yeah, no, understood. And I think I can tell the difference just because in my own experience, after the show, when I go out and binge, I will retain water. Like I'll look puffier, but it won't look like soft. It's like a harder water type. It's a watery look, and there is clearly a difference there. Together,
you won't feel any granules. You'll literally just feel skin on skin, still, but you can see it's a softer area.
Yeah. And then I guess my concern with that would be the one that the natural guys usually voice, which is that there's a fear of flattening out. So I guess it would come down to a balance of making sure that carbs are high enough, water isn't dropped too low, and then also balancing that with the sodium intake so that you get rid of that water layer while at the same time ensuring that the vascularity and the muscles stay full, right?
Well, for the naturals, like I said, I agree with the guys who spoke. I keep that more steady and high, so it's really not as huge of a variable on those guys. So I kind of agree with that. So to rid water, I mean, if your water's high and your sodium's kept high and constant, your aldosterone's going to be low. And as long as you didn't do something dumb like load potassium, which actually increases aldosterone, you should be pretty solid. And then you can mess with your carbs, which we'll get into. Yeah. So I'm pretty much in line with those guys, I think, at least for now on the natural side.
Sure. So Cliff, I just had a quick question for you. 2 to 3 gallons seems like really high, like a normal person wouldn't drink that much. Is there a reason why you push water that high during peak week? And do your athletes have water that high throughout their entire prep? Or in other words, how is it that you go about deciding how much water someone gets for their peak week?
Yeah, well, I guess I should preface that by saying, and I saw what you posted on Facebook, and everybody wants to know about the rapid backload peak that I do because it freaks a lot of people out. And so, I guess obviously I'll use different methods for different people, but I would say the rapid backload is the method of choice that I use for 90% of my bodybuilders, and then I use more of a subtle loading strategy, subtle backload strategy for about another 5%, and then I probably only front load about 5% of my bodybuilders. So with that, the big load with the rapid backload, I'll load carbohydrates very, very high on Friday, the day before the show. And so the way I view with the rapid backload, because that's the one a lot of people want to know about, is everything is in preparation for that Friday load. And I should also start by saying, with this rapid backload, it's a lot of things that I learned through experience along the way, and some of the mechanisms through which it works. I have, like Jason said, I think I know what's going on, and I hypothesize what's going on. But sometimes I'm just sort of taking an educated guess here. And so to consume so many carbohydrates, I need to have a lot of water available to be stored with the glycogen in the muscle tissue. And so I don't want to increase water excessively from early in the peak week and then increase it excessively on Friday. And so I'm just preparing the body to be able to eliminate any excess. And that way it will be a consistent. So if somebody's going to take in 3 gallons the day before the show, I don't want to go from 1 gallon, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then up to 3, because I am not confident that their body will eliminate that excess, because it's such a drastic change from one day to the next. Whereas if I bring it up high earlier in the week, it's already being established that this excess water is going to need to be eliminated, and that way, the system will be all ready to flush out any excess that will be coming in.
Mm-hmm. One of the times that I've raised water really high myself is after, say, a day I go a little bit overboard with sodium, and I can tell visually that I'm retaining a little bit more water. I find that by drinking more water, I help to sort of flush that out. Is that something that you guys have had any experience with?
Well, and like Eric said, the more water you drink, it will affect your electrolyte balance too. So, that's definitely going to play a factor. And like you said, keeping it consistent will also minimize another variable that you might need to adjust. At least that's my take on it there.
Right. Eric, let's say you have a competitor who, for whatever reason, whether it be stress or maybe they just miscalculated their sodium or what have you, does spill a little bit in terms of water. How do you approach that from a water perspective?
Well, it is difficult to fix a spill, and sometimes when to fix a spill, it's like, oh, it's after prejudging, but we think you're going to be in finals anyway, so that's the only time you really can do much. But I actually experienced this in the show where I won my pro card. I spilled over at prejudging, and we had to fix it by finals. We were pretty sure I had my class on lock. And we pumped the water up very high and did multiple pump ups. And that was basically, as a scientist, this is one of those things where we'll have to basically say, like, look, if anyone is talking about hard science behind peak week, they're overstating the evidence, because we have very little. But experientially, I've definitely seen that if you can identify a spillover early, obviously simply not giving them as many carbs as planned, and pumping the water up and increasing pump ups is a good way to try to ameliorate that and change it. And it definitely worked for me. Now, as far as what to do with sodium, that's a good question, because as you pump the water up and you're urinating more, you're probably losing sodium as well. And you can spill for a lot of reasons. So, looking back on it, I looked good for finals, but then I very quickly lost it. And part of me, I think maybe, is that I got sodium flat, whether sweating on stage or from all the pump ups. But I was able to look good enough to then, win my class. And then I started to fade as I was, taking pictures with my sword. So perfect timing for the internet, But no, with my clients, I've experienced the same thing, that if I can notice, if I get their pictures morning of or after prejudging, and there is a reason to save it, like if we think they're going to be in the finals or they've got a second division they're competing in, driving water up and doing multiple pump ups is a way that can kind of save a spillover.
Mm-hmm. And last on the water questions, Jason, maybe I'll have you comment on this one. Earlier in my bodybuilding career, I did manipulate water a lot more, and I have manipulated it for like powerlifting events just to make a certain weight class. And there have been 2 different approaches that I've taken. One would be like a taper throughout the week. So say I drink, 8 liters Monday, Tuesday, cut it back to 4 liters Wednesday, 2 liters Thursday, 1 liter Friday, and then just sips on show day. That would have been one approach. The other approach would be a load throughout the whole week. So say 8 liters, 8 liters, 8 liters, 8 liters, 1 liter Friday, and then just sips on Saturday. In my experience, I looked about the same in both, which was flat, as it were. But do you think that there would be one approach that would be better if you did, say, have someone who is cutting water? And then also, I think that this might make a bit of sense to me, because if you are loading carbs at the same time, then at least from an osmotic perspective, it would make sense that the carbohydrates are going to draw water from somewhere, and so it could very likely be from the subcutaneous spaces. Maybe Jason, I'll have you comment on those 2 approaches, and then we'll probably move on.
Okay. Can we define cutting? Do you mean like completely out, or are you talking a taper?
Well, the first approach is a taper. So say half at Wednesday, then half again on Thursday, Friday down to half a liter, and then Saturday is just sips.
Okay.
And then the other approach would be a load all through the week, and then a sharp cut on Friday. Say
how much
Friday afternoon.
See, I mean, to me, if you're at 3 gallons and you drop to a gallon, I mean, depending on the size of the person and you get enough carbs in, you can still be full.
Yeah.
Again, still you're cut down to a quarter or lower. That's probably not going to work. So I mean, again, it can still work out. So it's kind of slightly hard for me to answer because I mean, it still can work well. You're just going to get enough carbs in.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there's one way that's better. That's why literally when I'm dealing with naturals, I just try to keep it fairly steady on what they're drinking. I find out, okay, you're on 1.5 gallons. Let's keep it basically there to eliminate the variable. So I don't know if I would say one of those ways that you're talking about is better, but I would say that if they still have 1 gallon on Friday, it's probably going to be fine.
Okay.
Anything under that for a man is probably going to have them a little bit of flat, in my opinion.
Interesting. And then what about an enhanced guy? How would you approach cutting the water in that case?
Again, it comes back to just knowing his body during the time of his diet. So, if he's holding a lot, and I can tell this, I might even have to use some Diazide, which is prescription, diuretic, and have a guy do that. It really depends on what they're holding. We might be able to get it out by a taper, 3 gallons, 2.5, 2, down to 3/4 on Friday, and you might be fine as you carb up. But it's going to be a judgment call as the coach, honestly, on what you think is going to be necessary. Generally, I try to go with a taper and maybe just some over-the-counter like Expel or H2O Remove, something like that. And that usually does fairly well for an enhanced guy. Try to stay away from the harder ones if at all possible. If you are going to use them, you want to get something like Diazide that's not ripping potassium out as well. So if something were to go awry, that it's a sodium issue. If you're using like a loop diuretic like Lasix and you got a problem, you got a big problem because you don't know if it's sodium or potassium, and you could kill yourself by messing one way or the other. So anyone out there who is enhanced, who's thinking about doing that, I don't recommend any of those loop diuretic type things.
Interesting. Cliff, I know that you had your hand up.
Yeah, I guess when dealing with natural guys, they still get really freaked out about the water. And I think that comes from the term holding water. People will say, "Oh, he's holding water." Well, our body's composed primarily of water, so I hope to God we're all holding water. And so, I find that term generally just describes when something has gone wrong, whatever it may be. It could be one reason or another. They just say, "Oh, he's holding water." It means he looks like crap. And so, I think they need to think of it, realize that the water is just going to follow solutes. And so you just need to make sure that when you're drinking water, that it's going to end up in the appropriate places. And that's going to be from finding the appropriate balance of carbohydrate intake and sodium and potassium. And I always, this is a gross oversimplification of a way to describe it, but it works well for new competitors. I would say, if you're drinking water normally, the excess will be urinated out. It's almost like a bathtub, an empty bathtub with the drain open. You turn the faucet on, the water will drain out at the appropriate rate, and you won't spill over the tub. But if I start throwing sponges in there, the water will stick to the sponges. And if I throw too many sponges in there, eat too many carbs, then eventually the water will start to spill out of the tub. And so, it's making sure that the water ends up in the appropriate places. And for a natural athlete, most of our water will be in those intracellular compartments. So our ratios are already skewed in our favor. It's when we mess up the natural ratios when we start to see problems. And so it's not the water that's the problem. It's a lot of times the carbohydrates, the sodium, potassium that will cause the issues, and the water will just follow if they're not appropriately placed.
Eric, do you want to comment on that?
Actually, no, I think they covered that really good, or really well, if you like proper English. But which again, I don't speak. But I did want to just say probably a useful thing to just kind of caveat the whole discussion is, at least from anything I say for the listeners, it only applies to natural competitors. And if I do speculate on something else, it is just that speculation, because I actually don't have any experience working with these competitors. So I think it's very cool that we're able to, have multiple coaches on here who have experience with both. But it is interesting to hear how much the game changes when you're working with someone who's, introducing chemicals into their body.
Yeah, and I should also add that my experience with enhanced athletes is so extremely limited. I've worked with a few, but it's not very extensive. So I would defer to Jason on that in all areas.
Mm-hmm. Eric, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the idea of like a dry backload. So say you cut water while at the same time simultaneously increasing carbs. Do you think that makes sense from an osmotic perspective? Do you think it's likely to pull water from the subcutaneous spaces, or is it just going to pull it from the blood volume and cause the person to flatten out? And have you experimented with that yourself or with any of your athletes?
Yeah, I've always read that. The idea is that if you load water, or sorry, if you load carbs and don't load water, then all the water in the body will be pulled to where the carbs are, and you'll just have all your water and your glycogen, and you'll look amazing. It just doesn't really make sense from a survival standpoint when you think about it. And a lot of the assumptions around the quote unquote sodium potassium pump and some of the older school approaches kind of mistake the intracellular and extracellular space with the subcutaneous and intramuscular space, which are not synonyms. And I just don't think you're going to be able to massively disturb some of those homeostatic functions in the body at the point where that would work as well as expected. And when you think about it, even if we take that approach of, hey, water follows carbohydrate and has to be stored with glycogen, 1-to-3 ratio. If you are limiting water, you're limiting 3/4 of where that fullness comes from, right? So you can carb load a lot, but if you're only getting 1 out of those 4 grams being loaded into the muscle per se, if that's even the way it really works, which I think is a huge question mark, then I think you're going to have trouble filling out without water when you're loading carbs, if you can even effectively store that glycogen.
Right. Jason?
I missed that part when you put that question on me. I guess I can't handle 2-part questions, so.
No,
I agree with Eric, and the reason I raised my hand is because when I said I believe, one of these things that you're talking about are things I did in the past with myself. Dan Duquesne in his book had formulas based on, if you were completely depleted, how much carb it took based on your lean body mass to, become full. And I used those formulas a couple times. And on Wednesday, I would take in the full amount that I needed. And even as a Bantam, it was like 1,200 carbs, and I took a gallon of water in. I'd always wake up the next day, and I looked pretty darn good. But what I did was on Thursday, I would bring the carbs down a little bit, and then I would only do 3/4 of a gallon. Well, I started to fade. Friday, I would do about a half a gallon. Well, I was even flatter. The best I looked during that process was when I still had a gallon in and on the most carbs. So there was times when I would move that to just Friday, and I'd hit a shit ton of carbs and use a gallon of water, and I'd look pretty damn good. Had I used more water like Cliff does, maybe I would have looked even better, but I looked pretty damn good. So my point is that by the time I got to Friday and I was still hitting a good amount of carbs, we're talking 600, and I only had a half a gallon or less, that's when I went to shit. So it might sound good in theory, but I just don't think it plays out really to do it that way.
I guess the only difference there would be like you didn't when you decreased your carbs, you also decreased your water. So it'd be interesting to see if you decreased your water while increasing your carbs, if that would still cause you to fade or not. Yeah, Eric.
Yeah, I see your point. But I mean, the carbs were still pretty darn high. I mean,
right? Yeah, true.
But
yeah.
I get what you're saying.
Eric.
Yeah, it's fun. I've read a lot of the same stuff, and I think Dan was probably the big pioneer for this stuff. But when you get really number heavy and you do all these equations based on like what you can load based on your body mass and all that stuff, I've also seen it just doesn't seem to play out. And it makes sense when you think about it, because every single person, even at the same body weight, is going to have a different total energy expenditure. So we're making and you don't know how much of their energy they're burning from carbohydrate or fat in a given day, how much becomes blood glucose that is burned off, what is burned in their daily lifestyle, and then what actually gets stored as glycogen is a huge, you're guessing there, right? If I have found that when you have someone who's has to go on very, very low carbohydrate and total calorie numbers to get very lean, and you try to load them on what makes sense for their body weight, they almost invariably spill over with most approaches. And I like to use the analogy, and I know we're kind of skipping into the carbohydrate loading, so feel free to cut me off here, that we're not just like a gas tank. Muscle glycogen is like a gas tank that shrinks or engorges itself, the actual size of it, based on how many carbs it's getting, right? Because your ability to synthesize glycogen increases or decreases with your carbohydrate intake, right? So if you've been on a low carbohydrate diet for months on end, and then you try to load, it's not going to quite work out as you expect, and vice versa too. If someone is on a high carbohydrate diet and that becomes their primary fuel source, you can load them on what makes a lot of sense. This is a good amount of carbs for the person, but they might chew right through it and not end up looking very full.
Right. Go ahead, Cliff, and then we'll move on to sodium.
Yeah, one last quick thing to add, and I totally agree with what Eric said. When people try to reduce water while loading, water's held in a lot of compartments in our body. And the main area, it's held in plasma and our intracellular spaces. And we want it to obviously be held in the intracellular space. But that's like assuming that if we cut water, our body is just going to say, oh, I know, it's a survival mechanism to keep this homeostasis, to keep it steady and to keep the ratios appropriate. It's our body's not going to take the approach of, I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to get shredded for a bodybuilding show. Let's pull it only from the places that will be appropriate. So it's really a gamble of where that water would be pulled from and where it will end up.
Okay, so how about we move on to sodium now? We started with Cliff last time, so Eric, you can take this one away. And if you want to mention potassium, you can. I don't know if that's something you guys actually track and manipulate or not, but you can throw that in there as well if you want.
Good question. So yeah, I think there's a difference between theoretical and practical. So I'll kind of talk about a bit of both, and cut me off if I go on a monologue too long here. But yeah, going back to that whole principle of the sodium-potassium manipulation to try to get, the water into the intracellular, not the extracellular space. That is very much true in a theoretical, like Petri dish kind of sense. But what we forget, like I said previously, is that subcutaneous and extracellular are not synonyms, and likewise intracellular and intramuscular are not synonyms. And one of the extracellular places is where you'd think you wouldn't want water, like if extracellular equals bad, which it's not that simple, is the vascular system. And what I have found most consistently in people who cut water and cut sodium is that they have a hell of a time getting a pump backstage. And they have this kind of muted look. And especially with like when they have Dream Tan number 2 backstage, they just kind of look like they're wearing a brown paper bag. And they just don't, They've got no pop to their physique, and I can almost, if I can see that they're in shape, I can almost always guess they did something funky with sodium, So, as we know, as our health organizations in some countries, in my opinion, may have misguidedly suggested, you reduce your sodium intake to try to get your blood pressure down, so sodium we know has an acute effect on blood pressure. Whether it has a long-term effect is debatable, and it depends on your genetics. However, there is definitely an acute rise in blood pressure to you having a large sodium intake. And as we know from the few studies that have been done, and anyone who's done a contest prep, is your blood pressure and your heart rate drop substantially in the course of getting very, very lean. This is due to a lot of factors. But in the end, you can see some pretty crazy baseline blood pressures at the end of a prep. And it's even harder to get a pump during training. You're on a lower carbohydrate intake. You're on a lower total food intake, so your sodium tends to be lower. You often are cutting out foods that typically have high sodium intakes just as a course of either trying to hit your macros, or if you have a more kind of holistic approach and you're eating less and less processed foods. So your carbohydrate and sodium levels are going down throughout prep. And and you are getting flatter, and and your blood pressure's dropping normally. So in the end, you haven't had a good pump except on maybe the day after refeed days for months, and you forget how much of an effect that has. So I think sodium is one of the most critical variables to manipulate acutely. And typically what I do is right before the pump up starts, they're having anywhere between 1 to 3 grams of sodium. It's not the same thing as table salt. Right before they start their pump up. And I try to encourage them to eat semi-normal foods, the foods they've been eating throughout prep, unless they've gotten to the point where they're eating all kinds of weird stuff because of diet behaviors. Like I wouldn't want them having Walden Farms on a salad right before they pump up or anything like that. But yeah, so that's kind of where the theory and practical mix is. Ideally, if they're on a diet that makes sense for foods during peak week, not a high fiber diet, what I'm doing is I keep potassium. I just tell them to keep their foods relatively the same, manipulate carb intake, and then acutely I bump up sodium right before the pump up of the day on stage, and that's it. I keep it very simple, and I try to keep, like we talked about, water levels constant, so that therefore I know that for the most part body levels of sodium are the same. So when I do increase sodium, I know it's an actual physiological increase in their sodium levels in the body.
Mm-hmm. Eric, how do you go about getting someone to get in 1 to 3 grams of sodium 15 minutes out?
Well, I think, and I'm saying this off the top of my head, I think half a teaspoon of sodium is just over 1 gram half a teaspoon of table salt is just over 1 gram of actual sodium. So I will just tell them the appropriate serving size of table salt to use, and I'll have them just throw it in water and drink it. And my competitors always hate me when I tell them to do that, but I know that it's going to get into them the fastest way that way. And then just go straight to the pump up. And I tend to separate that from the meals. I know a lot of people will just put it on like, a rice cake with almond butter or something like that. But in my mind, I don't want to slow down the digestion. It probably doesn't make a massive difference. It depends on how long the pump up is, how long you're going to be on stage. I mean, I've seen WNBF pro shows that prejudging lasts an hour. So it depends. But yeah, I just shoot it with water. It's gross, but it works.
Yeah. Okay, Jason, what are your thoughts on sodium?
Well, here's how I generally set it up. When someone starts with me, I have them add about 1/8 of a teaspoon of sea salt to all their meals. If they're bigger competitors, let's say heavyweights, super heavyweights, it might be then 1/4 of a teaspoon or something like that. But I'll have them just do that through the whole diet, and that'll stay unchanged. And then what I do generally is I ask them to use mustards and Franks and different things, Walden's Farms, just extra condiments that are getting sodium in them as well. And then a lot of times what I'll do during the peak week is I'll leave in the added sea salt, and then I'll pull out the condiments Thursday or Friday, just for a slight variance downward. And I do what Eric then has his athletes do before stage, although I haven't gone up to 3 grams, but anywhere from 500 milligrams to 1 gram of sea salt. I'll usually put it in something with like sweetened, highly branched cyclic dextrins or something, so it doesn't taste like total shit. His guys are hardcore if they're drinking that shit with water. And that usually works pretty well. So as you can see, all I'm really doing is keeping it pretty constant, and then just kind of pulling the condiments out just to give a little bit of a variation to create a downward shift. But you're obviously not nearly losing enough to go flat or anything along those lines. You've got the sodium you need to carb load. That's important for the listeners. You need that to carb load. So that's generally how I do it. There have been times where I've pulled it earlier, or I will have them half. So let's say they're doing 7 meals a day. I'll say do it, put it on 3 or 4, cut it out of 3 or 4. And that would be for the guys who hold a shit ton of water and they're enhanced. But generally the first map I gave you is what I do with sodium.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it kind of reminds me of people will sometimes purposefully decrease carbs before a load so that you become more responsive to the carbs. So you kind of like decrease sodium a little bit, and then when you get that hit of sodium, it's like vascularity comes out like crazy. Yep. I've experienced that myself. And yeah, Eric, like your thing works. Like Eric, if you guys don't know, was my coach for my pro debut last year. Yeah, when I shot the table salt, it was just like the veins came out almost immediately, and I could feel my heart picking up. I was like, I don't know if this is good or not, but at least I have the veins, so.
So a lot, man.
Yeah.
Right. Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Jason and I get to the same place. You know, he probably starts his people with the added condiments and added salt just at a higher sodium level. So then the bump is still relative to where they are. And with you, since there wasn't that added in, and if we kept your food the same, then the addition is still an addition. So yeah, I think the principle roughly seems to hold well. And I don't know about you guys, but I've seen that tends to make one of the more consistent and obvious changes in a peak week is throwing the sodium in at the end, at least in my experience.
Yeah, definitely. Yep. Cliff?
All right, here's where I probably start to sound like a crazy person compared to some other people. All right, I'm going to start once again by prefacing saying I'm going to talk in context of the rapid backload because that's what everybody seems to want to know about. And I'm going to say if you are not absolutely sure of what you're doing before you try any of this, please run a practice of it because I don't want people showing up looking terrible on show day and saying, "Well, Cliff told me to give this a try." So,
Cliff, before you dive into that, maybe just quickly, just debrief everyone on what a rapid backload is, okay. And then, talk about the sodium.
Okay, so rapid backload is a peaking technique that I came up with some years ago, and I used to do front loading at the beginning of my coaching career, and it went well. It really did. But I think we've all experienced that situation where we're depleted, and maybe we see a competitor have like a massive refeed or a massive cheat meal or whatever it is, a lot of water, a lot of sodium, a lot of carbohydrates, and they wake up the next day and they just look amazing. And there's a certain tightness to the skin and fullness that I just didn't see being recreated quite the same. You know, there's a subtle difference, but quite the same with the front load. And I kind of set out to mimic that. And so I will, a lot of times, I'll deplete carbohydrates earlier in the week, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later. And then I'll load them the day before the show. Male competitors generally taking in anywhere from 850 grams to one of the highest I've ever done is 1,600 grams of carbohydrates the day before the show, and usually around, once again, 2.5 to 3 gallons of water with that. And so, a lot of people want to know how that's possible. And so within the context of that rapid backload, everything during peak week is designed to set up that load and allow the body to be able to process efficiently and handle any excess of one thing or another that there may be. And so sodium, I don't control my client's sodium during the large amount of the prep. But as we start to get close to peak week, I'll start telling them to add sodium. And my goal is to increase. And I'm going to just give a general range. It doesn't mean I never step outside these lines, but for my male competitors, starting about Saturday before the show, I'll put them between upper 4,000 milligrams, maybe 4,800 milligrams, up to 6,000 milligrams daily. Female competitors, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams daily. And the idea behind this, and this is also where I come into, I have hypothesis behind this based on some of the research I've read, and then it works in practice. So it may be what's going on, what I believe, but it may not be. It may be something entirely different. So my goal with increasing the sodium is to just allow the hormones to adjust to be able to eliminate excess sodium. They may see a slight holding of water in the first few days of the increase and going up to that high of sodium, but this will usually correct rather quickly once the body adjusts to eliminating the excess. Then the day before, now the reason high is because sodium is going to be very high on the day of their carbohydrate load. And the reason I do this, one, like Eric said, sodium just does a lot of beneficial things for bodybuilders. It's a primary regulator of blood volume, and it's one of the regulators of blood volume, so it will help you get a pump. And it also is, like Jason said, largely it is a factor in how glucose will enter. There's a co-transporter with glucose and sodium, and so when you're loading that many carbohydrates, in one single day, I'm really looking at efficiency. I need everything to load as efficiently as possible and as quickly as possible, because timing becomes a little more important. If you're loading on Wednesday, that probably doesn't really matter. But I'm loading the day before, and I need to make sure everything is going through efficiently. So the day before the show, sodium will sometimes go up to around 8,000 to 10,000 milligrams the day before the show, when the carbohydrates are very high. And then potassium, on the other hand, now I run a deplete stage earlier in the week, carbohydrate deplete. During that period, I will actually deplete potassium. My idea behind this is that I am trying to, potassium being one of the primary, intracellular ions, I'm trying to reduce that and essentially eliminate as much water in general from the body as I can, and just get them as flat as possible without going to very low caloric intakes. And then early on in their load, early Friday morning, I will have them consume very high potassium foods like sweet potatoes and red potatoes. And so potassium levels may reach somewhere around 12,000 milligrams the day before the show. And I'll start high on Friday morning. I see Eric laughing at me because these astronomical numbers. I'll start high Friday morning to load higher potassium levels and essentially offset the depletion that we've done. And then I taper as Friday goes on, and then allow sodium to come back in balance with that. And I know that sounds super, super tricky, but it works really well, and then you'll see the progression. And then when they wake up Saturday morning, I don't do anything crazy with it. I keep sodium and potassium levels pretty even until right before stage, where they'll take, much like the other two guys, they'll take in a big dose of sodium before they pump up, and then we're just ready to roll.
Yeah, Cliff, I guess one of the red flags that I would see with that approach would just be that oftentimes when I have like a very high sodium meal, like even if I go out for sushi, I'll wake up like 4 or 5 pounds heavier. I'm not a really big guy, and I do look more watery. Like at least in my own head, that's the way I see it. Do you ever see anyone spill as a result of that approach?
I would say even just slightly spilled. I've never had a disaster, I'll put it that way. And I would even say slightly spilled is probably only a handful of times. In fact, more of a flat look is more of the, that I've seen more often. And but one thing I always tell competitors is, and I guess there's another thing that's going to be an issue, because I think hopefully some of the people listening have seen some of my competitors on stage, and it's funny though, because there's a certain disconnect with the way we feel with the way we look to a certain extent, because as bodybuilders, we start to associate, especially over a prep, we start to associate with depleted with good, and there's a certain disconnect. And so a lot of times my competitors will wake up and they'll say, "Oh God, I'm spilled," and then they'll send me the pictures, and I see that they look fine. And then also when they hit the stage and they get the pictures back and they say, "Oh, well, I can't believe that's me. I look great." So that's where I wouldn't trust a lot of people to use this approach on themselves, because keeping out of their own head would be a big problem.
Eric?
Yeah, first I have a brief question for Cliff. And this is going to be so hard to differentiate between what competitors do at a restaurant post-show, but maybe for your competitors who have multiple shows back to back, did they hit a point where they just look like shit on Sunday or Monday after the show?
It's funny, because that was a big concern of mine when I first started doing this. And, Zach Roush, I'm going to use him as an example. One of my clients just competed this weekend. He took second in one of his pro classes. And they did a Friday night prejudge and a Saturday morning night show. And we loaded him. Yeah, we loaded him on Thursday, held his conditioning. And people hear this and they say, that just sounds crazy to do this approach. But, honestly, I have found that once the look that I want to see has been achieved, maintaining it is surprisingly consistent and surprisingly easy. When they hit the next day, I can usually expect they're going to wake up looking a little bit flatter, not quite as full, but pretty similar conditioning and crispness.
For how long can they maintain that?
I mean, I can maintain it for the next day, and then I've gone into, I mean, they'll look continuously flatter the longer they go. So there's never a point where after the load, I've never experienced at least, where the next day or the day after you just think they look like garbage. Everything seems to be pretty well regulated, and one of the reasons I love this approach is because it's been I've had success with it, and it's been surprisingly consistent for me. When I have my competitors, I have them check in while they're loading, mid-load. They'll text me pictures of what they're looking like, and I know by Friday at 3 p.m. if they have a certain look that I want to see. I know precisely what they're going to look like the very next day, mid-load, because I just start seeing it come together, and it's extremely consistent. And for me as a coach, it really takes the pressure off me because of the consistency. I don't need to worry about any variables. A lot of times I'll set the plan, and you guys know when you set the plan and you just see things come together and you don't need to adjust it. It takes a lot of stress off me to be able to know, all right, we are right on point. I know where we're going to land tomorrow. I'm feeling great about it, you know.
Sorry, I'll just go real quick. Cliff, what do you think it would take for someone to spill then? Because if I was drawing up a program to have someone spill, I would spike their sodium up to like 12,000 milligrams and give them 1,000 grams of carbs. So like, what do you think it would take? Like,
you know, I've had some competitors actually want me to test that, and I usually aim low. I aim low. If I estimate somebody can take in, you know, if my thought is I can estimate somebody's going to be able to take in 1,200 grams during their load, I'm usually going to put it at 1,050 or 1,100. You know, I'll put it a little bit low, because I'd rather come in a little flat than a little spilled. I've had some competitors want to almost challenge me to see how many they can handle, but I'm not really in that. I would say if we're going to look at spill, I would almost reverse what I do with sodium and potassium. I would load it up really high to just higher levels, and I would cut water. But where their load level is at, and I know we're going to get into carbohydrates, but a lot of people think this massive person, you know, well, I'll say Doug Miller. Everybody wants to know about how Doug Miller's peak went, because he's just the most massive person. And Doug's load was pretty high, but it wasn't near the highest that I've had. In fact, some of the thinner clients that I've had will require some of the highest loads, because their metabolic rate shoots through these carbohydrates almost as fast as you can give them. And so the biggest factor of whether or not somebody's going to be able to handle a high intake is going to be dictated by their metabolic rate, not necessarily their size. And so, you know, and then one last word on sodium. I don't know if the other guys noticed this, but I've noticed this. And this may be a controversial topic to talk about, but there's a drastic difference in how much sodium I can give many of my white competitors compared to my black competitors. Black competitors just seem to sometimes have a harder time dealing with the changes in sodium intake. And so I take a little bit more conservative approach usually with my black competitors compared to my white competitors, because sodium seems to blur a lot of my black competitors more so than the white ones. So I take a little bit different approach based on race in that regard.
Interesting. Jason?
Well, I just had a question because, you know, like I said earlier, as a bantam back in the day, I would do 1,200, and I started just moving it before stage, because when I load on Wednesday, and I doing a gallon, I went more water now and just seeing how it went. But my question is, I would never do that same type of thing with like a figure girl or a bikini girl, because they're not lean enough. Is this something in my opinion, they're not lean enough? Is this something you're only doing with shredded bodybuilders? Because I mean, they can't hold anyways.
Yeah, I have done the backload for a few figure competitors that are very lean and very thin that need to be bigger. I don't do it for bikini competitors because, you know, I don't think vascular and shredded is the primary description of the ideal bikini competitor. And so it's only shredded bodybuilders, and you have to be, and I cannot understate this, you have to be very, very lean to be able to make this work. If you're not very, very lean, it's not going to be a disaster, but it's just not going to go as well. Yep. And so that, yeah, it's only the most shredded bodybuilders. If there's any pocket of fat that you can pinch, don't do it.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was figuring.
Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, Jeff, just kind of going back to your comment about if you were going to give someone a program to spill over, I would agree that a crazy high sodium intake the day prior might do it, but I've seen it acutely. Sodium is a very safe thing to play with. Like if I get pictures from somebody and I'm surprised, like, crap, you look bad, I don't know why. My go-to is like, have some more sodium, because I know that there probably won't acutely be a negative effect if they're on that day competing. I actually remember Berto did his pro debut in 2008 at, I want to say, the WNBF Mid-America, which I think Dr. Joe's show. And Dr. Joe was running around just giving sodium to all his competitors backstage, just kind of willy-nilly almost. And I think I can't remember if I spoke to Dr. Joe or Alberto did at some point, but this isn't something that he's seen as well. That sodium seems to be a pretty safe bet because of all those things that people talked about, it being a co-transporter and blood pressure, all those things. It's hard to go wrong in a very short-term period.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when you load sodium for a single day, usually you won't see negative effects the following day. But really, once you start getting into a multiple day sodium load, that's where I've noticed some blurring. And it's probably why, going back to your question, Eric, when do you see them spill the day after? And I think a lot of that has to do with the carbohydrate intake does come down a little bit the day of the show. And so does sodium intake. There's nothing crazy. There's only 2 hits before prejudging and before night show, and then it's a somewhat moderate sodium intake, at least compared to what they did the day before.
Gotcha.
And yeah, so just to make sure that we've got the bikini class covered, do you guys basically just go like constant water, constant sodium with those? Or is there any manipulation like the shot before they hit the stage for fullness? I can start with you, Eric.
Yeah, for my bikini competitors, I mean, to be honest, it is very, very minimal. I'm like what I consider a low amount of sodium, like a gram or something like that, and not even like I'm trying to get vascularity, but just pump. But yeah, I really don't run much of what would look like a peak week. I kind of take them out of a deficit and I make sure they aren't spilled over, depleted. But that's really about it. It's pretty straightforward. I kind of just run them straight through most of the time for bikini competitor. Figure competitor depends on the organization. Some, like a WNBF figure competitor, most of the time has to be just as lean as a bodybuilder or close to it. So that looks more close to what we've already talked about. Female bodybuilder, obviously the same. And then, yeah, if you're talking about a figure competitor who is borderline lean, then kind of a hybrid of what I mentioned for bikini versus the harder classes.
Mm-hmm. And are the other 2 guys, are you in agreement? Or if you disagree, you can speak up.
Well, I would say where I go with a bikini competitor has to deal with where their starting point is. If they are less muscular and need to add some size to hold their own on stage, I'll just start from their point of where they're at with sodium. I tell them to start adding up their sodium intake a few weeks out, and I find out where their baseline is, and I'll increase it a little bit and increase going into the show to create some fullness and give them the ability to get more of a pump, like Eric said. But for example, I have one client that took she's competed. She took 3rd at the Australian Olympia, and she's very muscular. She's genetically elite, and so we have to tone her down. We lose muscle going on purpose going into it, and with her, I'll actually deplete sodium just to soften her up and shrink her down a little bit. So the approach will go either up or down depending on where their starting point is and where they need to end up.
Right. And just while we're on the topic, because I think that for the most part, bikini competitors, since they don't need that dry, hard, vascular look, the manipulations will probably be more moderate throughout. When I posted about this podcast on the Facebook, on my Facebook, there was a question about women entering peak week, and if there are any variables that can be manipulated if they anticipate PMS. or is it just considered a bummer if it happens? So is there anything you can do to reduce bloat or water retention as a result of the PMS or of the cycle generally? Cliff?
Oh, okay. Sorry. For the most part, I think by the end of it, some girls will lose their period. You can do with that what you will. But if that is a concern, I will tell them sometimes to keep on hand just some sort of herbal diuretic, like, Expel. It's not usually something I love to use, but it's good to have just in case. And I'll say this to the women out there, when it comes to PMS and bloat and things like that, speaking from an outside perspective, it makes you feel way worse than you look. I can barely notice the difference, and most of the time, not at all. They'll say, I feel like I'm holding tons of water and I feel like I'm bloated, and I look at the pictures and I say, there is absolutely no difference here. And a lot of times I'll just take their pictures side by side from where they were, pre-cycle, and I'll just put them side by side and I'll say, look, you are precisely the same. So sometimes even if they do get it, I won't even give them the Expel or anything like that because it's just not necessary.
All right. So guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick break for about a minute, and then we'll come back and we'll get into carbohydrate manipulation, cardio, and training, and then we'll talk about some show day stuff like pumping up, tan, and all that sort of stuff. So we'll be back in just a minute. So guys, we are back. I guess we'll kick it off with carbs, since I think this is probably the big one where views might differ. So just up front, I guess I'll clarify the two big terms or the main approaches that are used. One would be a front load, where you increase carbs earlier in the week, typically a Monday or a Tuesday, and then they'll often taper back down and then perhaps increase again later in the week, or maybe not. And then the other would be the backload, which is the one that Cliff has popularized, which is where carbs are relatively low throughout the week, and then there's a massive spike right before the show. So how about, actually we can start with Jason or go ahead, Eric, sorry.
I was telling a story to Cliff, and I thought it actually might be cool to actually share it on the podcast during the break. But I was recently in Australia doing some talks with Lane, and we talked to a lot of bodybuilders. And I got a fair number of questions about the rapid backload. And one of the things that I was emphasizing was that these aren't just techniques, they're also skill sets. So you can take the same on-paper protocol and have two different coaches run them, and you may see very different results because you develop an eye over the years, and you know what is pushing it, what is dialing back, what is the right amount to add or take back. Even just how to communicate to your client to get them consistent pictures or photos to you so you can tell what's going on. So I said, Cliff is an artist with the backload. He kills it every time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be able to be an artist with the backload. So I think that's just one thing to clarify. It's not only a discussion of techniques, it's also a discussion of skills.
Sure.
And Cliff is skilled.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. He's got the skills.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Cliff.
Well, along those lines, and I want to kind of clarify, because sometimes we get newer competitors where they get the approach that this peaking style is right, this peaking style is wrong. There are so many ways to peak properly, and like he said, any coach, they get better at peaking because there's so little knowledge to start from. Like Eric said, there's no research on peaking, and so you get better at it as you go along. And I've gotten proficient at diagnosing. I always say there's such an important part of peak week is diagnosing the situation. And sometimes flat and spill can look eerily similar. And if you don't think it's important to be able to diagnose the state, let's say I'm a medical doctor, and maybe I'm the worst medical doctor that there's ever been, and the nurse tells me my patient is in a coma. Well, coma looks eerily similar to death, and maybe I can't tell the difference, and the way I'm going to treat my patient in a coma is going to be drastically different from the way I treat my patient who is dead, even though from the outside they look pretty similar. So that should tell you right there, diagnosing the situation is half the battle.
Right. Yeah, Eric, it's funny. I have a similar story. I was prepping a guy for a physique show, and he had listened to my previous podcast with Cliff. And so when I sent him his peak week documents, he felt so deflated. He was like, "What happened to the rapid backload idea? Like, I was expecting all these carbs." And I just went with a more moderate approach. Just because, Cliff, I know that you've had a tremendous amount of success with this. But my skepticism comes from the fact that you do tend to deal with a very elite breed of athletes from what I see. They tend to be genetically gifted bodybuilders who probably, as I see it, would look pretty damn good on any approach. Do you think that there's a role to play there? Not to take away from what it is that you contribute to their success, but do you think it would work as well with someone who, say, isn't as genetically gifted as a bodybuilder?
Assuming they're lean enough, yes, I'll say that. Because when I first started coaching in like 2010 and 2011, 2011 is when I started doing this, and I would use it. And I didn't have really any elite bodybuilders back then. It was just amateurs trying to become pros, and that was the method I would use. And then as they started doing well, I got more elite competitors coming to me wanting to do it. So it does work well. But I will say when people send me messages about it and they want to know about it, 99% of my time, 99% of the time, my response is don't use this, because don't go do it yourself. At least if you're going to do it, you need to practice, because I don't trust most people to be able to use it first time out. The first time I ever used it, I did not use it going into a show. I had two competitors that were contest lean. I had this idea that it could work, and I said, let's try it. And they let me try it and work out some of the kinks before I used it on anybody else. That would be really irresponsible if I had this crazy idea to throw tons of sodium at you and tons of carbs, and let's just see how it plays out on stage. So, I tried it out multiple times before I used it in a game time scenario, so to speak, and I would recommend anybody do that before they even thought about trying to use it, coach or just average competitor trying it on themselves.
Right. So how about we narrow in on carbs and what it is exactly that you guys do there. So Jason, I'll start with you.
Well, it's definitely variable. Let's start there. I did 5 peak weeks today, and it ranged from a fat load to a load on Friday that was pretty high. I won't use the same terms that we use to refer to Cliff's, because I'm not trying to pull that off. And I did a load that was moderate Thursday and Friday, about 300 on Thursday, 300 on Friday. And then I had one where they got a cheat meal on Friday night, because we found that works very well for her. So, I don't really know if I can put a rule together. I can start and say the reason the one girl fat loaded was because she's done awesome on high-fat keto diet, and until we pulled out our carbs, she struggled. She was bloated one day, not bloated the next, no matter what carbs we used. And so I said, screw it, we're not putting carbs in. You've been on keto long, you look great, and we're going to fat load. And so I did that one that way. As long as you have the protein and fat high enough, you're still going to get some carb conversion through gluconeogenesis and things of that nature. The other ones were feel, I did it on feel. Like, I knew the one guy was really lean. And like I said, I've had experience myself on high carb loads Friday before. And so I did it that way with him. I don't know how else to put it into words other than say carbs are going to be variable, and it's going to be based on how the person dieted and how they look and how lean they are. So, I don't know how else more specific to get on it. I'll leave it at that for now, and I guess let other guys go around the table.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's reasonable. Cliff, maybe you can get into your whole approach next.
Okay, I guess I should start by I'm going to start off by saying, like we've already touched on, the body likes to keep a pretty static ratio of intracellular to extracellular fluids. And so one thing I think is a misconception, no matter what approach you take, and I'm sure you guys have noticed this, that if I were to keep sodium high, keep water high, keep protein high enough, keep fat high enough, but reduce my carbohydrate intake, you're going to get a flat but very tight look. Yep. Would everybody agree with that? You're going to have this thin skin feeling. And competitors want that thin skin feeling with the super full feeling. But the problem is I've reduced my carbohydrates. I've reduced intracellular water, because I've reduced intramuscular water. I've reduced my glycogen levels, and there's going to be less water inside my muscle. And so there's going to be less water also outside. And so if you increase your, your storage inside the muscle, there's just going to be a natural thicker feeling to the skin. And it's going to be very perceptible to the person that is experiencing it, because they just don't feel that thin skin. But to the outside people, it's not really perceptible. Maybe if you pinched it, you could feel it a little bit, but maybe not to the degree that it's noticeable. And I always tell people what looks really good right up on somebody is not necessarily going to translate to the best look on stage. So keep that in mind. You're never going to combine a super, super full look, no matter what approach you take, with the thinnest possible skin you can experience. And so I'll state that for the record. So with carbohydrates, with the backload approach, I will bring carbs up a little bit over Saturday and Sunday, a week out from the show. As Eric said, if carbs have been really low, their body may not be efficient at storing glycogen at this stage. So I'll bring carbs up for 2 to 3 days just to fill them out a little bit, and also make sure they don't get too flat for the deplete stage that I'm going to put them through. And so after those, something along the lines, typically in the range of 2 to 3 high carb days, whatever their high carb day is, in a row. And then starting Monday, sometimes Sunday, if they really need to flatten out more, Sunday, Monday to Thursday, I'll run through a carbohydrate deplete phase. And I'll say carbohydrate deplete, not calorie deplete. A lot of people want to drop their calories down really low, but I don't think depleting yourself near death is an ideal state to be in before a bodybuilding show. So I'll usually keep calories pretty similar to what they've been dieting on. Take from carbohydrates, give to proteins and fats, just to maintain significant amounts of weight just from the water loss. But if calories are the same, that's just water. That's not going to be muscle tissue being lost. And people get really nervous watching the scale drop like that. But they'll see a couple pounds lost in a couple days. So I'll do that. And once again, this goes back to creating the ability to supercompensate with glycogen. And I know a lot of the research around supercompensation revolves around a 3-day deplete and a 3-day load. But in my experience, anybody who's in an aggressive 3-day load knows that that's probably a recipe for some sort of spill. And so I just didn't find it was as consistent. So carbohydrates may go down to Monday through Thursday, could go down into anywhere from 40 grams to 100 grams if somebody's been having a high carbohydrate intake throughout prep, usually from a lot of vegetable sources. And then the day of the load, it can vary, like I said, 850 grams to 1,500-1,600 grams. I would say most bodybuilders, male bodybuilders, fall in the range of 1,000 to 1,250 grams of carbs on their load. And my female bodybuilders will probably fall in the range of 550 to 800 grams. Females per pound tend to not be able to take in quite as much as the males. And then same thing, like I touched on before, there's a big difference for me between my black competitors and my white competitors. Insulin resistance issues are prevalent in the black community, and so sometimes they're not as efficient at storing that glycogen in a timely manner, and so I will play it a little bit more conservatively with them and aim on the lower end. And I find if I get a little too aggressive, they're just not quite as sharp.
Eric?
Yeah, so what I do with carbs, that's basically the big question. Cool. So yeah, it's I'll give some background here. So I came from kind of the school of learning from Dr. Joe and then Lane and then Berto primarily. But of course, I really kind of learned to coach from my fellow coaches at 3DMJ. You know, Brad, Jeff, Berto, myself were the originals, and then also from Andrea now. Brad Loomis actually changed the way I do my front loads a little bit because he had experience working with Skip LaCour, actually. Takes a pretty aggressive skip loading approach. So he kind of ended up blending the approaches, and we started eventually, I'd say probably the majority of our clients are front loaded if they're lean enough. And the approach looks not as extended over time. I think if you look at some of the older approaches to front loading, sometimes you'll see a load happening very early in the week or even the weekend before and tapering down and coming back up on Friday. I'd like to load carbs on Tuesday and taper down Wednesday, Thursday, and come back up on Friday, and then typically taper into the show after that to try to kind of keep that look. And again, I think like the two other guys have been saying, a huge part of this is what you're seeing and context dependent. I never run a blind front load. It's not like I send them an Excel sheet and tell them, hey, email me on Saturday night. Let me know how the show went. I think it's absolutely critical. You have to babysit a peak week. So typically the way I do it is I try to get all the work done by Friday night. And it's not that I don't think there's value in adjusting on the day of on Saturday. It's just that with online coaching, you can't always be sure that where the person travels to, that they will be able to get pictures to you and have internet access, depending on how far they have to travel, what the hotel's Wi-Fi looks like, what their data plan is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, time zone differences, all that stuff. Even just a simple delay in my email could mean that I miss communication back to them before prejudging. So I like to try to be bulletproof in my approach, and I look at pictures on Thursday and Friday before the show, and I try to do everything in my power to know that they're going to go to bed with the instructions that they need to be in the right position the next day, and I give them a little bit of kind of self-guidance tools. If they're really in a bad way, or if I'm sure, because I've worked with a person before that will be able to communicate the morning of, then I will, be like, hey, give me pictures first thing upon waking up, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, so lots of information there. Specifically on the carbohydrates, typically I use an approach where they're using refeeds 1 to 3 times per week. And they typically get more frequent throughout the whole diet. And I try to keep the refeed carb intake levels similar to where they were in the off season. And I will eventually, on most times, have to adjust it. But most of the time, I'm keeping those carbohydrate intakes from the refeeds the same throughout the whole prep. And a big thing I'm looking at is how do they respond to their refeeds? What do they look like in response on the day of and the day after their refeeds? And this is something that becomes more of a, I guess, a key variable I pay attention to as they get closer to competing. So anyway, I always base the carbohydrate intakes that I give the person on that front load that I talked about on Tuesday and Friday based on what their refeeds were. So typically the load on Tuesday and Friday will be somewhere between 90 to 120% of what they had on their refeeds at their highest point. Typically I will try to throw in, and it just depends on what they're looking like on Thursday and Friday, but refeed-esque carb intakes on those 2 days, and then somewhere between kind of the midway point between their low days and their high days will be what the taper between Tuesday and Friday look like. And then the day of the show will be probably 75% of their refeed or slightly lower or slightly higher, depending on what they look like Friday night. So yeah, that's more or less the approach I take. Again, it's more often than not, maybe 50% of the time. I guess that's not more often than not. That's half and half. I end up adjusting based on what I'm seeing, especially on Friday. Sometimes I'll make adjustments on Thursday if they're looking way out of whack. But I have like kind of like Cliff mentioned, he knows there's certain things he wants to see. There's certain things I want to see Friday night, and slightly spilled over is fine, and that's typically where I'd like to get them to. Or if they look great, then I'm probably just gonna keep that as well. But if they look really really sharp Friday night, that's not always necessarily a good thing. as well.
Yeah, Cliff.
Yeah, and maybe Eric and I messed up. We were having some good discussion during our break. And so, regarding the carbohydrate load, like he said, I think sometimes when people go to bed on Friday night and they're really, really sharp and they think, yeah, I've nailed it. Well, Friday night is not show day. And I think sometimes people get panicked when they haven't peaked on Thursday or Friday, and it's important to note that you don't want to peak midweek. You want to peak the day of the show. And even when I load people, and this is where Eric said you need to be able to identify the state that they're in. When I load people, there's a certain eye that you start to develop. Like I'm waking them up early on Friday, and I'm giving them, let's say, 1,200 grams. When they wake up in the morning, I know what look they're going to have, or I like them to have, and then I have them text me pictures midday. And I know that what look I like them to have. And actually, as I load them, I want to see some blurring. I suspect that because I'm giving them so many carbohydrates in such a short amount of time, the body cannot keep up with synthesizing glycogen quickly enough. And my guess is that some of that glucose is just floating around in the spaces between. And so, I see the blurring, and I see the blurring increase over the course of the day Friday. And I want to see that. I want to see them blur Friday night, just subtly, not massive blurring, but just subtly. And like I was telling Eric in the break, I've gotten to the point where I realized, like early on, I used to think if somebody was really sharp on Friday night, I would think, oh man, they're going to look crazy the next day. I can't wait. But then they would wake up the next day and they wouldn't look bad, but it just wasn't quite as sharp as what I had seen in the past. So if I can get them to the point where they're blurring just slightly Friday night, I know they're going to wake up the next day when that glycogen can be synthesized and the glucose can make it in the right places. They'll be really sharp on Saturday morning.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed in every single show I've done is that I always think I look incredible Friday night, and then Saturday morning I always wake up really, really flat looking, like really flat, and there's like not a vein to be seen, and like my forearms usually get really vascular more than anything else, and it'll just be like just dead muscle, like there's no definition to it whatsoever. And then sometimes, like most shows, I would say, by the time prejudging rolls around, I've filled back out as I've kind of like rehydrated and so on. But no matter what I do, and I've been very aggressive at shows, it always seems like Saturday morning I wake up really, really flat. Is that common in your guys' experience?
Yes.
Do you think
I would say, I don't know, there's a more recent change in bodybuilding shows where they have like live judging, where the show starts, and I've noticed now that I've had people who get on stage.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you start right over from the beginning? You just cut out completely for whatever you just said.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I said, yes, I've noticed that. Typically, people don't look as good in the morning as at night, typically. And the reason why I really started to notice this and believe it was now that there's more shows are done as what's called live judging, or in a one-show format, where you just get on stage in the late afternoon, early evening, and you go till the night's over. Is that when I peak people for that show format, they typically look better than at least compared to their prejudging shots when I have people in a two stage show format. And I don't know if that's just a time thing, like it just takes more time for water and sodium and carbs to do their thing, or what. But that's something I've consistently noticed, and you can be very, very aggressive, and it doesn't always necessarily counteract that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that I usually look better by the night show, and I tend to underestimate what it is I think I can get away with, and I feel like a lot of guys who take maybe the more conservative approach tend to fall into that camp. Like I see so many guys come in looking really hard and full at the night show, but they just looked really flat at prejudging. And one of the things that I've done is get up at like 3 a.m. and start eating, and I guess that does help to a degree, but I think that a lot of guys might be surprised with how much they can hold on to without spilling. But yeah, so I guess
that's. So I was just going to echo what you were saying. I'll tell, like, if one of my spreadsheets will say, eat your first meal X numbers of hours prior to when you think you're going to be on for prejudging. And sometimes that means you're going to be eating at 4 a.m. or 3 a.m. And that's just kind of like, well, shit, you probably didn't sleep very well the night before anyway, and you've been dieting for
Yeah.
6 months. I just kind
you're
of suck
you're
it up.
psyched to get up. It's like, 3 a.m. I get to eat. Sweet. Yeah.
It's
One,
true, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Jason, go ahead.
one thing that we didn't touch on here is, I noticed the same phenomenon you're talking about, and a lot of times it came from clients. I would have them go have a steak, sweet potato, something like that, and they're buttering the hell out of that thing, and filet mignon's got a lot of fat in it anyway. So one thing that we really didn't touch on was fats and their role in loading. I use fats because I don't go as crazy with the carb loads, and I want them to hold and not burn through it. And as you use dietary fat, you're going to hold it better. And usually, I get my athletes up early, and I want them to have at least 3 or 4 meals in, and I'm controlling their fat intake too when I give them their macros, and usually tell them what fats I would like to use and things of that nature. And I find that helps fill them back out a little faster, and I find that it helps them not wake up so flat in the morning as well. So that's just one thing to think of. My body's that way. I actually do better and look better on a ketogenic diet than I would say on a low fat 200 to 250 carb diet. So, a lot of times I'm taking that into consideration with guys and gals as well. That, yeah, I could give them a lot of carbs, but if I don't have any fats here, they still could be really flat. So
yeah, I've actually noticed that when I load on fat as well, I look better and I look more vascular. For whatever reason, like it can happen quite quickly too, like even an hour or so out from the stage. If I have like peanut butter and some chocolate or Reese cup, that sort of thing, it can really make a big difference in terms of my fullness. So I don't know if that's just like increasing the blood volume with the triglycerides in the blood, or if it's increasing the intramuscular triglyceride store. But I've found that fats usually don't cause me to spill until a couple days out of massive overfeeding.
And that's not spillover. If you massively
it's
that's
not
fat.
That's fat.
Yeah, exactly.
You will look worse though.
Yeah. Cliff, I'm curious to know what you do about fats, because you bring carbs so ridiculously high that I feel like that would be a pretty potent stimulus for fat storage.
I keep them. The fats will be pretty much during the load. The fats will be pretty much just whatever the carbohydrate source I'm using. You see pictures of a lot of my guys posting what foods they're eating on Friday. You're going to notice that my guys eat a lot of Cheerios and sweet potatoes, and during their load. And the reason for that is that it just those foods go down rather easily. Compared to some others I've tried in the past. There's nothing magical about the foods, but they also have the sodium-potassium ratios that make it easy for me to manipulate as needed and make any changes. Early on in the first couple of years I started doing the backload, instead of Cheerios, I was having people do oatmeal, and they looked good, but that was just way too much oatmeal. They're like, I'm dying eating all this oatmeal right now. And so I switched it to Cheerios, and a lot of people can kind of just snack on them, throughout the day. And so I'll do that. I'll keep fats just whatever they end up being with those foods. Typically, I'm going to say in the range of 30 to 35 grams for that day, maybe 40 at the high end. And then, like these guys, on show day, I'll rely on fats a little bit more. Carbohydrate, my approach is to take a conservative approach on show day, because with the massive loading, the loading should have been accomplished the day before, and then just fine tweaks on the day of. And so I don't need to push carbohydrates. So I'll take a moderate approach, maybe 20 to 40 grams every couple of hours, but then fats will be bumped up anywhere in the range from 15 to 25 grams every few hours. And I'll use things like even Reese's peanut butter cups the day of the show that have moderate carbs and higher fats. And I'll even use olive oil just because sometimes it travels well. They can dump it in a tablespoon and just shoot it back. It doesn't taste great, but it gets the job done. And so, I pretty much the same thing as the other guys.
Right. And then what about between prejudging and finals? Do you guys just do a repeat? This is what I've usually done. It's just a repeat of what they did leading into prejudging.
Yeah, I typically make it a repeat unless I am fixing something that didn't look right the day prior. So, for example, if I think I need to push more into them for prejudging, I might give them an adjustment to eat more Friday night and then eat more prior to prejudging and then let it taper off. But most of the time I set it up just because it's easier for them to pack and conceptualize just as a repeat for prejudging and finals, unless of course it's one of those live judge shows that I talked about. But typically I keep it the same. And I do a double salt load. So actually, the funny thing is everyone was talking about how crazy Cliff's sodium loading is. It's really not that different from what I do. I might give someone 2 grams twice, and that's 4 grams of added sodium on top of their diet, which might be 3 to 4 grams. So I think that's not that crazy of a sodium load.
Yeah. What about you, Jason?
You're talking about after prejudging?
Yeah.
Typically, I instruct people to go with their family and friends who came and get a meal out, chicken, sweet potatoes, something of that nature. Keep it clean. Usually have them go ahead and get water, nothing that needs to be limited there. And then after that, I'll usually just have them repeat the macros that I had used from the morning, unless obviously, they're really flat or there's some problem. But generally, that's how I set it up and then go from there if I have to adjust anything. But so really, it's kind of a repeat of the meals in the morning with just a meal out with the family that, it's not going to really cause a problem. It's going to have a little more fat, salt, but it's all fine at that point, really. And I let them have usually 10 to 12 ounces of water, depending on what their water situation is for that day. So I don't really do anything that's, too drastic after prejudging.
What about you, Cliff?
I manipulate a lot after prejudging. If it's a single class, say it's a pro class and there's no heavyweight, there's no lightweight, there's just a single class, I will start adjusting things to see what might work for them the next show. I may push carbs really hard to see what their spill point will be and see how much more aggressive we can get with their next one. I'll maybe give them a bunch of sodium, because if they come in softer at the night show and it's a single class, the judging is done with. It doesn't matter. So I test their limits. And if it's not a single class, this may be a little controversial, because bodybuilding, is always say focus on yourself. If I know it's not going to be a single class, I actually tell my competitors to scope out their competition in the other classes. I have their families take pictures of the best guys in the other classes, and we make the look that will make us most competitive against the person we view as our primary competition. If we're going against somebody that's fuller but we're more conditioned, we may get a little bit fuller just to. If we're going against somebody that's maybe a little bit leaner, we may reduce their carbohydrate intake to flatten them out a little bit, but make them sharper to compete with their conditioning, but still be bigger. So I'll go whatever way we need to do to try to get the win.
Yeah, I mean, that's insanely impressive if you can do that by a distance. I feel like that's impressive, to say the least.
Well, if they're U.S. clients, I do it through text. If they're international, Facebook Messenger has been really beneficial. The timing can be difficult because I have some Australian clients, and obviously that's way very opposite time zones. So a lot of times I'll schedule check-ins with them, and I'll just wake up throughout the night. If they're gonna check in with me at 2 or 3 a.m., I'll set my alarm and I'll wake up, check my Facebook Messenger, adjust. And I'll say check in again, 4 hours later, and I'll just wake up at 5 or 6 a.m. and I'll adjust, and we'll just make sure we have the game plan, ready to roll.
Yeah, that's awesome. What I'll do next is move on to cardio. So what you guys do for that as peak week goes on. So I'm gonna start. I think I'm back to Cliff. So you can start here, Cliff.
Super simple, short answer. I usually just manipulate slightly from where they're at with their base. If they're depleting, I'll increase just a little bit and then no cardio during their load. If they're doing more of a conservative approach where I'm just slowly going up, I'll just slowly taper down a little bit. It's not something I like to adjust to very high amounts. I don't want people's legs being sore on the day of the show, and I don't want them tired. So usually there's some sort of reduction in the day or two prior, but that's about it. Works within a range of their base.
Eric?
Almost exactly the same, to be honest. It's the only times I have to make large manipulations if I have someone who had to do a lot of cardio to get into shape for whatever reason, which is rare. But then I end up just reducing their cardio in the peak week itself, which might change a few other things, but for the most part, it's very, very similar to what Cliff said.
Okay. Jason?
A lot of times I'll pull the HIIT out about 7 days out, let the legs rest, or start, letting the water get out of them, let them heal. I'll keep the list in, a lot of times I'll say keep the walking in till a lot of times Wednesday, and then at which point I might just switch them to posing on Thursday and Friday for X number of minutes if it's a bodybuilder or something like that. That's generally how I do the cardio. So basically it's a cutting back as well as the other guys.
Right. And then what about resistance training? I'll start with Eric on this one.
Yeah, I typically this kind of, I'm going to start a little broader again.
Sure.
A lot of guys like to try to deplete with the resistance training. And I think in many cases, unless you've had the opportunity to eat someone up into the show, they're going to be relatively depleted anyway because they're a dieting bodybuilder. So I don't go hog wild with it. But what I typically do is I pull out any exercises which have a large eccentric component. So if they're doing RDLs or like heavy dumbbell flies or something like that, those are gone because I don't want them to be sore while they're trying to load and pose, and you just pose on stage really. So and then I shift the rep ranges up a little bit and pull the RPE down, so they're just a little further from failure. So the volume is similar, and I get it done by basically 2 days out. And I normally shift it so the leg days come earlier. So for example, if I had an upper lower split, it would become lower upper, just to give an extra day for any kind of related inflammation to go away, so that there is no blurriness in the legs. So everything's over 8 to 10 reps. That's like kind of the lowest I'd go. Similar number of sets, similar setup. I just condense it into an upper lower most of the time, and then just keep them far from failure and pull out the eccentric stuff, and that's about it. And then one more thing. I have them do little pump up circuits occasionally if I need to, morning of the show, prior to the show, and maybe potentially on Friday and Thursday, but not always.
Jason?
Well, similar to Eric, I stop, the failure training. I make sure that that's done. Usually around, I'd say that Monday, I start asking them no more failure training. Legs are usually done 7 to 6 days out. Bodybuilders, I will tell them though to flex the legs a lot, especially as the carbs are coming in. Just keep the muscle a little fuller. I don't see a need to not at least pose them and do something to push the blood. And I know some guys just rest them completely and do nothing and don't touch them again. I think they'll be a little fuller if you flex them, pump them up as you're eating. Let's see. So no failure. I generally don't do you'll see guys start circuit training on a Wednesday or something. I generally just keep them on their same split. The legs are done early. And I ask them no failure training, and I'm usually done. The last training session is usually Wednesday, and then again, like I said, I switch them over to posing and things of that nature. There have been some Thursdays where I've had guys do a modified circuit because I felt like they needed a little bit more depletion before I hit a bigger load on a Friday. But generally, a lot of the training's done last session on Wednesday. I want the body to be rested and healed up, really.
Right. Cliff?
So with what I do, I guess I should say with my whole thing with peak week, obviously I manipulate certain variables drastically. Carbohydrate, sodium, potassium, and but I'm really big on minimizing all other variables because I think a process as a coach is to be able to pinpoint when things aren't going as you'd expect. What is the variable causing the issue? And so this may sound really controversial, but when it comes to peak week training, almost all of my clients will be on the exact same peak week training protocol, because I know that sounds lazy on the part of a coach, but for me, it allows me to get a consistent look from person to person. Because the process is very similar from person to person. The goal is the same. You reduce the same as the other guys. You reduce the intensity, and it's pretty much just to maintain what you have, create glycogen storage, and allow the body to rest up and heal up a little bit. And so I'll give the same protocols to pretty much every person. So that way, if something's not going as I would like it to go mid-peak week, I don't even have to think, is it the training causing this issue? It's a variable that I can completely take out of the equation. They're not training too hard. They're not doing this exercise, that exercise. So minimization of variables is a very important part to me. And so, I'll do each body part trained once across Monday through Thursday, like legs on Monday, back on Tuesday, chest on Wednesday, and shoulders and arms on Thursday. So, I'll just, and then a whole body circuit on Friday. And that way it minimizes a variable that I have to worry about, and I can focus on the other variables.
Interesting. Eric, I just wanted to pose this question to you. Do you think that the case could be made, like from, say, a sarcoplasmic hypertrophy perspective, for really increasing the reps, so doing a lot of like 20 to 30 rep sets, just a lot of pump work? Is that something that you think could have merit, or?
Well, there's always other effects. Anytime you manipulate one thing, you have to think about other things. You'd have a depletion effect going on there, so that would probably affect what you'd have to do with. It's more total work, right?
Yeah.
If you would actually just calculate the total work, you started doing 20, 30 rep sets, that'd be a significant increase in volume.
Yeah.
And I don't know the actual timeline. If we want to call it sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which I'm only semi-comfortable doing, then we're talking about increased glycogen in the muscle as well as other stuff. I don't know the timeline for that, how long that adaptation would take. It might be that for you to get that effectively, it takes weeks, and I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
I don't think we have data on that. I know some people do it, and they go very, very heavy on depletion. But yeah, you're already going to be depleted in many cases, So yeah, I don't know is probably the overall answer, and I'm skeptical as my second.
Yeah. No, I think I'd agree. I guess just stick with kind of what's worked in terms of training throughout the majority of your prep, and then make sure you're rested up so you can store the glycogen. It seems to be the most reasonable thing to do. Okay, so now we'll move on to some actual show day stuff. So maybe what you guys use for tanning, color, oil, that sort of thing. So Jason, I'll start with you on this one.
Sure. At least in my area, you can always find a company called Liquid Sun Rays. And if they're not the sponsor spraying, they'll usually be at the shows. So, it's like where I'm at in the NPC, 95% of the time they're there, and their colors were great. I've used it when I've been at nationals, the junior nationals, everything, and judges always like it. So I get sprayed, and I always tell my clients to get sprayed. I think it's the easiest. In the NPC, they don't like Dream Tan, so there wouldn't be any Dream Tan. You would just be using the color. And then those companies usually have oil that they'll do backstage. And the caveat with that is always, you want to look like you have a nice sheen, but you don't want to be too oiled. You'll start, that blurs you too and just looks bad up on stage. So those would be my things with tan. I'm not a big fan of spending 8 hours trying to put 10 coats of shit on me with a sponge, so that's my recommendation usually to my clients.
Right. Cliff?
For bikini competitors, I'll usually just tell them to get the tanner. They're not going to be sweating on stage, and at least not significantly to worry about running or anything like that. And so they'll just usually, and it has a clean look that they want in bikini. For bodybuilders, like Jason said, they don't usually like Dream Tan at the NPC. But if they allow it, sometimes I'll have people do a spray tan and a really thin coat of Dream Tan just to give that sheen. I love the glow of the Dream Tan on stage. And for most of my bodybuilders, I use Dream Tan. I guess I'll say with Dream Tan though, you have to be really, really lean for it to look its best. I always say Dream Tan highlights. It highlights whatever you have. If you're incredibly conditioned, Dream Tan will highlight it. But if you are off, or if you have a little bit of fat to lose, Dream Tan will also highlight it. And so you need to make sure you're really on if you're going to use Dream Tan, because it will highlight any work that still needs to be done. And and one last thing I'll say about Dream Tan too is that I think it tends to look better in person than in pictures. Just kind of my experience. I don't know if it's the shine or the reflective nature of it, but as you take pictures, it doesn't quite show like it does in person.
Right. Eric?
Yeah, not a whole lot more to add than what's been said, but yeah, I'll tell one funny story. Before I had really ever worked with a woman live, I made the mistake of putting Dream Tan on a figure competitor, and finding that her suit was all over the place and touching it, and realizing, oh, not everyone's a male bodybuilder. So, so that is one thing just to think about, some of the logistics. So, obviously, if you have a very complex suit, and Dream Tan, for those who don't know about it, basically never dries. It is oil based, and you can sweat and it won't come off again because it's oil based, which is nice. And I think it looks great if like you said, Cliff, if the person is lean enough, and if the organization, like you both mentioned, allows it. Some organizations really hate Dream Tan, not because of the way it looks on stage, but because of what competitors do with it when they're putting it on backstage and bumping into walls with their prep brains. Because again, it never dries. So you've got these dieted people who are incredibly focused on everything except their surroundings, covered in basically paint, bumping into shit and sitting down on toilets. And, it's not uncommon for a first-time promoter to put on a show, not really think about this, and then the venue will never allow them to use it again because it looks like a bucket of brown paint exploded backstage. So while Dream Tan is great, it is not uncommon for certain organizations like the NPC or promoters to say, no, you can't use it. And in that case, you have to find a good spray tanner. Often, if it's a well-established show, like Jason mentioned, they will have a good spray tanner there, but not always. So that's kind of one of those things where you have to look for some good recommendations from experienced competitors, get a good spray tan, and then the trick becomes how much oil to put on, and most people tend to over oil. I really like Dream Tan just because you don't have to worry about it. It's got these little gold flecks or bronze flecks built into it that will give you that kind of highlighter look, like Cliff mentioned, that are there. But yeah, if I can, for a bodybuilder, I like Dream Tan, at least the look, even though it is a pain in the ass. If not, a good spray tan with a light coat of oil is the way to go, and that's the same case for female competitors, is to get a spray tan unless they're a bodybuilder.
Right. One thing I would just add that I've had a bit of experience with is a product called Jantana. I actually really like this one. I like the way it looks. So there's a base product called High Def, which is kind of like Pro-Tan, except a little less orange and a little more brown. I find it looks really nice. But it's not quite dark enough. And then their Sheen product is called Ultra, and you put a coat or two of that over it, and it ends up just being really, really dark, and it looks really nice. It doesn't have the same glow as Dream Tan would, but it has more of like a drier look, which I actually personally really like. The only issue that I had with Jantana was that since it's water-based, it does run, and yeah, I experienced firsthand at the Mayhem that can just really like derail pretty quickly. But if you're not someone who's going to sweat a lot on stage, then I actually found that to be a fantastic product. Jason, I did also use Liquid Sunrays in 2012 at the Canadian Nationals, and that was a really, really good look as well. I really like that one. It's really dark, and
yeah, I've always found that they do a damn good job, and it's just a really nice deep dark brown that does well on stage.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that. In terms of like adding oil or anything to on top of the tan, there was one thing that I saw one of the competitors doing at my pro debut last year, which was he had a hair dryer, and he was like drying the Dream Tan, and it gave it like a really nice glisten. And I was using Dream Tan as well, but mine didn't have it. It didn't like shine quite as much. I guess it just like sort of melted it or whatever it was that it was doing. But yeah, that was one thing. One thing not to do over Dream Tan would be to actually add oil over it, because that just makes it run. I learned that.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's oil on oil. Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. But Dream Tan is kind of like you guys have already said, kind of shiny as it is. So you don't really need to do anything. But if you are going to, then the hairdryer actually looked really, really good. So it's just.
Well, I'll add one thing about the oil on oil. I will, in some cases, add a little bit of oil on top of the Dream Tan, but I'll smear it, and as you guys said, it will smear. But then I repat, and the only situation I'll do that, I base it. I tell the competitors to look out for the lights. If the lights are high, you don't put any oil. If the lights are bright, don't put any oil on. But sometimes you go to a show and it's really dim, and I'll use a little bit of oil to take advantage of the lack of reflective nature of the dim lights. So that's the only situation. I'll put just a little bit on and then repat.
Actually, one thing to add to that too. Sometimes, I don't know if you guys have found this, but the Dream Tan will not always be consistent bottle to bottle.
Yes.
Some are a little oilier than others. And if you get a very, very dry Dream Tan little tub, they're kind of like in what looks like a makeup case or makeup tub kind of thing, is you can just add a drop or two of baby oil and mix it in, and that tends to brighten it right up.
Good point.
Yeah, how about we talk about like pumping up backstage?
For the people that do the rapid backload, pumping up is extremely important, because the more, first off, they just have a ton of water in their system. It's not uncommon for me to see people gain 6 to 10 pounds of scale weight to the morning of the show, and that's a lot. And that means there's a lot of water just in their system. And when you pump up, you're going to make sure that those that you're getting the blood flow going and a lot of that water in the right places. And so I have people do a very aggressive pump up backstage. I almost tell them to go all out. And you hear people say you don't want to over pump because you don't want to flatten out on stage. And one thing I always say to my competitors is those are problems for people to worry about that haven't eaten 1,000 grams of carbs the day before. We don't have those problems if you're consuming that many carbohydrates, so you're not going to run through all your glycogen. So I have them do a pretty lengthy. I don't pump the legs. I just have them do some posing. Don't pump the abs, but everything else I have them go for it.
Eric?
Pretty much the same thing. And probably not as aggressive as a pump up as Cliff, just since I'm typically not loading them on 1,200 grams of carbs. But actually, funny thing you mentioned that is that I was very aggressively pumping up after my the story I told earlier about how I spilled over at prejudging on the show that I got my pro card, and I was surprised at how much it actually improved my look. And some of it could have been just that I was, mitigating a spillover, but I felt like I actually caught a pump that I hadn't felt in a long time. So I would say that, yeah, maybe there definitely is something to the larger your carb load, the more aggressive your pump up. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Jason?
Well, I'm more along the lines with Eric, for sure. The only time I would have someone pump up aggressively is if they're definitely spilled over, and I'd have them get into the weights and really get into it. Generally, I tell people bring some bands because the weights are usually too freaking heavy. They're all taken. Everyone stinks and they're over there farting. Man. So usually I just have them keep on their tracksuit, keep on their socks. They're not getting cold. Have them get in the corner and just go with their bands and push-ups, bands and push-ups, bands and push-ups. Start maybe like 20, 15 minutes out. I usually give them a couple Reese's after they've had the water and a little sodium, and I just have them not go crazy with it, pose a little bit in between. I'm not a real big fan of going and hitting 40-pound dumbbells and really cashing yourself out unless, I've seen pictures and it's verifiable that they're spilled, which generally doesn't happen because I err a little bit more on being a little flat in the morning and then getting more food in you. So that's generally how I ask them to do the pump up.
Right. Yeah, I pretty much do the same thing. One of the things that I do with the pump up is I find it can be a way to sort of balance out people's imbalances or make their proportions a little bit better. So, for example, I have a really well-developed chest, but not so great biceps. So I'll focus on really pumping up my biceps and my back, rather than doing a bunch of push-ups just to kind of like even further accentuate that body part.
Yeah, I'm opposite of you, and I do the same thing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Okay, so guys, we're pretty much ready to wrap it up, and we're going on 2 hours here. But I did want to take a couple questions from my Facebook. So if you guys follow the podcast, listen to the podcast, then you can follow me on Facebook. You can still request me as a friend, and that's probably the best way to have your question answered on here. So typically I post about these episodes usually a day or two before we record, and I'll select questions from the comment thread below. I'll also occasionally do that on my Instagram, so you can follow me over there. It's just at Jeff Nippard. So there was the most liked comment was one from Alberto Nunez, and it wasn't so much a question as just a comment. He said glycogen supercompensation. I think we've touched on this a bit, but I guess what he's referring to is the fact that if you're glycogen depleted, then you're going to have more glycogen storage as a result. I guess that this is more or less your baby, Cliff, so you can comment on that if you want.
Eric, if you even want to start it with this one, go ahead.
Yeah, just
Sure.
to briefly clarify what Berto's asking is, I think sometimes people, like an endurance athlete, will try to do. They will load carbohydrates to then load them more. And they're trying to basically, going back to that analogy, increase the size of their gas tank and then trying to get as much as they possibly can, so trying to supercompensate. But the difference is that, Lance Armstrong doesn't care if his abs spill over, right? So the idea is that perhaps we should not be mimicking the supercompensation protocols of an endurance athlete to the same degree, because if you're a little bit over, then you look worse, because we're not actually. So supercompensation can't equal spillover, I think, is the point that Berto maybe wanted us to make.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do a protocol that creates glycogen supercompensation, but I don't. Once again, I do the 1 day load rather than the multiple day load like endurance athletes do, because I've just found that if you try to deplete and then load aggressively for multiple days, the look just isn't quite the same. There is spill, and that's something that endurance athletes don't have to consider, like Eric said. And it's kind of funny because people get really hung up, and it is they get really hung up glycogen compensation, but they're sometimes not lean enough to worry about something that's more important first. And if you're not practiced with where you'll spill over or how to do it, I don't think the risk is worth the benefit. So make sure that you're practiced in it before you just try something crazy on show day.
Right. And another really good question, which would have probably been good at the beginning, is at what point during a prep do you decide if a competitor is ready to start reversing into a show? Eric, I'll have you start with this one.
That's a good question. It's when they look damn near stage condition, like perfect stage condition, because typically some people will wait until they're absolutely and peeled, but I find that process of getting shredded and peeled is normally helped by increasing food, because you get fullness back. It can sometimes, what seems like, stimulate more losses. So if someone is starting to get pretty full glute striations, but they're not like, we're talking about a male here typically, but they're not like crazy shredded, what I like to call legally shredded, where you've still got some hints of glutes, that's when I will start feeding them up. And how much that feeding up looks like is going to be dictated based on the individual and where they're at. But like once they're 95% of the way there, that's when I will start to feed them up, because I find that helps them get to 100% pretty well. And on a side note, when you are eating someone up into a show and they've been on higher carbs and higher calories for a while going into a show, at least with front loads, that's when I find the look is the most consistent. If I had 3 or 4 weeks of eating someone up into a show and I run a front load, I know it's a lot. I can know what I'm going to expect, because there's less disparity between refeeds and low days.
Right. Jason? When do you tell?
He hit that right on the nail. I was going to just say 95% ready, and then he already even said it. That's how I do it too. When someone looks like they're just about there, and we have time, I start increasing it. You know, I might give them 30 and split 50 pre, 50 post, and see how they do. A lot of people, before you know it, they're down another pound. Then I might give them another 20, put it here, and every another 30. And then I just go along those lines till they're about ready and see if I can coast in. You know, sometimes you guys keep upping people the whole damn time. But, you know, I think that we're all, well, Eric and I are in agreement. I haven't heard Cliff, but that's where I'm at with it too.
I think one thing I take into consideration is a little bit of the mentality of the person. If somebody is just breezing through and they're 95% there, I probably won't adjust it, and I'll just let them get all the way there before I start coming up. And we have time, assuming we have time. But if somebody is a high-stress person, I find that getting 95% of the way there and then bringing food up will create those losses, because I think they've probably been so stressed out that those last few pounds wouldn't come off unless I bring food up. And so, I look at the mentality and how much, because for some people, that food, that additional food that you bring up, it's almost like it's a godsend to them. You know, they can relax. They probably train harder. Well, I know they train harder, not just because of the extra fuel, but also like a weight has been lifted off their shoulders. They feel free. I can go into the gym. I have more food. And it just causes this mental adjustment that'll increase their NEAT, and they'll just start dropping. And so, that'd be the situation. But with people that are just kind of rolling, I'll usually just I'll just finish the job, and then once they're I mean, I'm splitting hairs here, but maybe not 95%, but I'm maybe like 99%. I'll get them there, and then I'll come up. I know that sounds terribly nitpicky, but yeah, I'm just trying to be accurate.
Fair enough. And then I guess the other side of that question would be, if you have someone coming into peak week who isn't quite ready, is that the time to really dig hard and say give them something like a protein sparing modified fast, where you just bring the carbs and calories way down to get that last little bit of fat off? Or are you probably better off going with an increased approach, a regular peak week, and at least having them come in full if you can't get them quite as lean as you'd like?
I'll make one small comment, is that the times when I do use a backload is typically when someone is not in shape yet and they won't listen to me and just wait and do a later show. So if they've got multiple shows in the season, basically what I do, I just move a refeed to the day prior, and then let them get a little extra food on the day of. I just restructure it so they're still dieting that week, and then I give them a very small, like have a steak and some steamed veggies for dinner with your family, celebrate, and then let's get back on the diet on Sunday kind of thing. But I'm not a huge fan of going into starvation mode to get someone on stage, because then they're going to be, if they really aren't lean enough, they're not going to get lean in a week. They'll get leaner, but now you're going to have someone who's still not lean enough and flat as shit. So that doesn't seem like a good idea in my mind.
Jason, do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I try not to let that happen, but if it does, I try to discuss with them doing another show. But I'm with Eric. I mean, you're not going to accomplish much in 4 or 5 days of, putting them on 800 calories. I mean, mostly you're going to hurt them, and you're going to hurt their look. It's just, if the work wasn't done by then, pick another show.
Yeah, Cliff?
Yeah, first action I take is I give my absolute best pep talk I possibly can to make picking a different show sound really good. And I almost try to, throughout the beginning of prep, because you know what, as prep coaches, I think we'd all agree, I hate when I tell a competitor that they can be ready by a certain show and it just didn't happen. I absolutely hate that. I made them that promise that they'll be ready, and it just didn't happen. And so sometimes, I'll say, let's pick this show. I'll give you that extra time for free. We'll make this happen, because, with me and with my clients, I like to emphasize that we're going into a show with a certain standard and we don't cut corners anywhere. So it's almost like I start people's prep with the expectation that if you're not ready, we're not getting on stage, and they almost agree to that beforehand, before we ever even start prep. And so I almost kind of get that guarantee from them before we even embark on the journey, and then that way I don't have to deal with it if it comes up.
Yeah. I will just share a different perspective, just a personal perspective. When I'm dealing with clients, I tend to do what it is you guys do. But with myself, in 2014, when I turned pro at the Mayhem, I knew what my competition was looking like, and it was a lot more conditioned than I was a couple weeks out. So I borrowed a page out of Lyle's book. He wrote a book on the rapid fat loss solution or something like that, where he outlined a protein-sparing modified fast. And I followed that pretty closely to the book, and I think I dropped probably something like 2-3 pounds, which at the end of a cut is pretty impressive in a couple weeks for a guy my size who competes in like the high 140s, low 150s. And so I did find that it made a big difference in terms of fat loss in those final couple weeks, that I think that if I had just resorted to increasing or keeping it the same, maybe I would have been a little bit fuller, but I think that based on how conditioned my competition was, I think I was better as a result of having dug for that show. So obviously a little bit more risky, but I think that if done right, it can be successful, or at least it has been in my experience personally.
Okay. I just wanted to say, I mean, a huge part about coaching, and I'm sure Jason and Cliff would agree with this, is that you might tell people on a podcast what you would do in most cases, but there's always going to be exceptions.
Yeah.
And my friend Jeff, not to take away from your accomplishments at all, but you hold on to muscle pretty well, having dieted you down once. And I think if there was anybody who would do okay with like a protein modified fast for a week, especially among the drug-free crowd, you'd be one of them who'd do okay.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't necessarily take that and throw it at an average genetics kind of more what we might call an ectomorphic guy, or he might turn from looking like a bodybuilder into a guy who might not lift. So.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree. I just figured I would share that because I mean, as sort of like a last-ditch approach, I suppose it could work, but you just do have to simply accept the fact that you could risk coming in looking a lot more stringy as a result of it. So just tread carefully, I guess.
Well, Eric, you made a great point there. I think we'd all agree with everything, at least for me. Everything that I've said on this podcast, for everything I'll say, when I do maybe like seminars or something like that, I'm giving generally what I do, but I'm sure there has been situations, and context is everything, where a person, of the context of the entire person's prep and what I know about them. Even though I say I usually do this, there are probably plenty of situations where I've done almost the opposite, and so I think that's important to mention.
Mm-hmm. And then maybe we can finish just by touching on the psychological approach. So like maybe how it is that you can maybe calm people down if they're fearful that they're not ready, which is really common, or just how you deal with peak week psychologically with your athletes. So Jason, we'll start with you on this one.
Well, I mean, there's a couple things that I've done in the past. I mean, if someone's a complete stress ball and I know it, I've used some supplements that'll help with cortisol, phosphatidylserine, things of that nature. Put it in the prep and the peak, that I set up. So that'll help with that. Mentally, I can write tons of stuff, but if it's that bad, I'd probably get on a phone call or either at least talk to them through Facebook on a live messenger and try to just talk them off the ledge and let them know, the hard work's done. They did everything I asked, and I believe that they're ready, and that having their coach's belief a lot of times will calm someone down in that type of area. Because the biggest thing is I don't know about you guys, but I've looked back at old pictures when I did hit really nice conditioning, and it didn't matter if I was 2 weeks out and shredded. I looked at those pictures and didn't think I was ready, but 6 months later you look at it and you're like, damn, I looked pretty lean for that show. So, I think we all go through it. So it's really, as the coach, you let them know that you believe that they put in the work and that they are ready. And I think that usually goes a long way with most of my people. They're like, all right, if you're proud and you think, I'm ready, I'm ready. So that's generally as far as I've really had to go with it. I don't have anyone who's ever had like a complete meltdown and went off their diet for 5 days or anything like that. I guess I'm lucky that way, but that's kind of what I would do.
Yeah, Cliff?
A couple things, like he said, I think having a relationship with your clients, and if they trust you and you let them know, I'm not going to steer you wrong. I wouldn't put you up on stage looking bad, and so that's a big part of it. But also, especially with my approach, I mean, I deplete them, I load them. There's lots of wild swings which can affect them mentally. So one thing I do to mitigate some of this is I give them a rundown of what to expect, not only physically but mentally during the peak week process. Each day, pretty much day by day breakdown. On this day, you're going to probably feel this physically, and you'll probably start to feel this mentally. And each day has the breakdown, and that comforts them, because I think a lot of people always wonder, is what I'm feeling normal? And a lot of times as they go through the process, I can usually pinpoint what they're going to feel each day. And if they are feeling exactly like I described in my breakdown, then they know this is normal. Everything's going according to plan. So that's a big thing that I think kind of puts their mind at ease, that everything's going as it should, and I don't have to worry.
Eric?
Yeah, similar stuff. A huge part, or you could even argue almost everything to being a coach is communication, developing a relationship with the person. And, a lot of us, I think most of us work with most of our clients primarily online. And so there's a time and a place to send an email if it's a very simple communication, but there's also time and a place to record a video message for the person, like an unlisted YouTube video, or to hop on Skype, or to hop on a video conference or a call. And when you've got someone in the final week who is really stressing about the way they look, I think in what Jeff is asking in that question is just to go over how much does stress affect things. And one thing I've seen is that the really stressed out, stressful people tend to have a more variable look. They tend to have less consistent weight loss, which can sometimes make a coach, and I've done this, I wish I hadn't, make inappropriate calls in the diet, like cutting their calories too early or too consistently or too frequently, because, what I assume is water retention is tricking me into thinking I need to drop calories early. So the peak becomes harder because of that. So having poise, as Jeff Alberts would say, is a very useful thing, and it comes with experience, but it also comes from your experiencing as normal. So setting clear expectations and helping the person understand what they're going to experience, especially if they're first time using your approach, is very important. Having good communication and like Jason said, sometimes as much as I'm normally like, hey, I want the client to know what I'm doing, what the evidence is behind it, not just what to do, but how and why. Sometimes I will tell them, hey, you just got to trust me. Like your objectivity, part of your brain is broken at this stage. It's very normal for that to happen. So just listen to me. Honestly, I swear. And if you just trust me these last couple of weeks, stop looking in the mirror. Just let me evaluate your pictures or video, and you will get on stage looking great. That can take a huge weight off the shoulders of the client sometimes if they're in a constant state of self-evaluation when they can't be objective. It can be very harmful. So those are typically the approaches I use.
Okay, so I think we've pretty much covered everything, and I think it's really cool that we can see that there's more than one way to get to basically the same destination. And I've liked the fact that there were a lot of different perspectives voiced here. So thank you so much, guys, for coming on and sharing all your opinions on this stuff. I really appreciate it. I personally learned a lot and found it to be very interesting, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. So guys, thank you so much once again for listening to another episode of the Ice Cream for PRs podcast. Thank you, Cliff, Eric, and Jason, for your time. If you guys like this podcast and you're watching on YouTube, please hit the thumbs up button. Feel free to comment with any questions you might have or any feedback. If you're listening on iTunes, please do give the podcast a rating and or a review. And I will see you guys in the next